It was the kind of rumor people whispered about in hospital corridors but never spoke of in daylight. A wing sealed shut, its doors welded decades ago, with a heavy chain across the handles like something out of a forgotten war. They said it had been the morgue once back in the 1960s before an incident no one could quite explain. Staff who'd worked here long enough to remember would change the subject when asked. Michael Harris never believed any of it. As the new facilities manager, he prided himself on fixing broken elevators, rewiring darkened hallways, and clearing out dusty storage rooms. He didn't scare easily, but the first time he walked past the old basement door, he felt something. Not a sound exactly, more like a vibration in the air, thick, almost metallic. The lock looked older than the hospital itself, scratched, rusted. Yet it seemed to be holding on, stubborn against time. The plaque above it, nearly hidden by peeling paint, still bore a single word in faded black letters: Morgue. That night, long after the day shift had gone home, Michael sat in his office staring at the blueprint of the hospital's lower floors. There it was, a room unmarked, a space with no listed purpose, cut off from every other corridor. It shouldn't have been possible. And yet, it was right there. He didn't know why, but the thought of what might be inside refused to leave him. Somewhere deep down beneath the fluorescent hum of the hospital's endless nights, something waited, and it had been waiting for 50 years. 2 days later, Michael found himself in the hospital cafeteria, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. Across the table sat Helen Price, one of the longest-serving nurses on staff. Her hair was silver now, but her eyes had the sharp, assessing look of someone who'd seen more than she cared to talk about. He mentioned the locked basement door casually, pretending it was just another maintenance concern. For a moment, Helen's expression didn't change, but her hand holding the coffee cup froze midair. She set it down slowly. "Don't go near it," she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. When Michael pressed, she shook her head. "There are things down there you don't want to know about. We were told never to open it, and I've never asked why." Then she stood up, tray in hand, and left without another word. That night, Michael stayed late again. The corridors emptied one by one, the distant chatter of nurses replaced by the steady hiss of the building's ventilation. The basement was darker than he remembered, the overhead lights buzzing weakly. He walked toward the door, footsteps echoing off concrete. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint smell of disinfectant gave way to something else, something older. A damp, earthy scent tinged with metal. As he stood before the chained entrance, he noticed a detail he'd missed before. On the wall beside the door, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of a handprint. Larger than his own, pressed deep into the chipped paint as if someone or something had leaned there waiting. The following afternoon, Michael decided to dig deeper, not into the morgue itself but into the hospital's past. In a dusty storage room above the admin offices, he found stacks of old personnel files, supply ledgers, and yellowed memos typed on paper so brittle it nearly crumbled in his hands. One folder caught his eye. It was dated November 1968, the year he knew the morgue had been shut down. Inside were incident reports, short, vague notes that hinted at unusual circumstances and containment procedures. Most of the pages were missing, but at the back, folded into quarters, was a single Polaroid. It showed a narrow hallway lit by bare bulbs ending in the morgue door, only the door wasn't sealed in the photo. It was wide open, and just past the threshold, the image blurred into a deep, shadowy black. In the lower corner of the picture, there was the faint outline of a figure, human in shape but standing too still, too rigid, as if posing. The face was impossible to make out. Michael stared at it for a long time before slipping it into his pocket. He told himself it was curiosity driving him now, but there was something else, an unease that clung to him even in daylight. Later that evening, as the winter wind rattled the high windows, he returned to the basement once more. The chain still hung across the handles, the lock still intact, yet he could have sworn the position of the handprint had changed. It was lower this time, almost at the height of a child. Michael didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that photograph, its black, open doorway, the still figure inside. By morning, he'd convinced himself it was just a trick of the light, an old, damaged photo that his mind had turned into something worse. Around midday, he crossed paths with Frank Daly, the hospital's night security guard. Frank was in his late 50s, heavyset, with the kind of blunt humor that usually put people at ease. But when Michael casually mentioned the basement, Frank's grin faded. "You're not poking around down there, are you?" Frank asked. His voice had an edge to it, the kind that made the question sound more like a warning. Michael shrugged, trying to seem indifferent, just curious. "I found some old files." Frank exhaled slowly and leaned against the wall. "Back when I started here, the old-timers told me something happened in that morgue. A patient went missing, not from the wards, right from the slab. Security searched for weeks, and then, one day, the orderlies just sealed it up like it never existed. No explanation, no report." For the rest of the day, the story wouldn't leave him. That evening, when the building had gone quiet, Michael found himself descending the basement stairs again. His footsteps echoed differently now, hollow, like the sound was being pulled into the door ahead. He stopped just a few feet away, the beam of his flashlight catching on the chain. That's when he noticed something he was certain hadn't been there before. The padlock was hanging open. Michael froze, the cold from the basement floor seeming to seep up through his shoes. The chain still hung loosely across the handles, but the padlock, heavy, rusted, stubborn the last time he'd checked, now dangled open like it had been. That way for years. He reached out slowly, fingertips brushing the cold metal. It wasn't broken, no signs of force, it had simply been unlocked. He told himself to walk away, close the door, secure the lock, and leave, but something deep in his chest pushed him forward. With a metallic scrape, he slid the chain free and pulled at the door. It resisted at first, as if welded shut by decades of stillness, then gave way with a sharp, hollow creak. The smell hit him instantly. Not rot exactly, something older, heavier, like damp stone and rusted iron, laced with a faint sweetness that turned his stomach. The beam of his flashlight cut through a narrow hallway, its walls lined with faded white tiles. Some were cracked, others missing entirely, revealing dark, crumbling concrete beneath. He stepped inside. The air was cooler here, heavy and unmoving. His footsteps sounded too loud, bouncing off the low ceiling. The corridor ended at another door, this one metal with a small square window at eye level. The glass was clouded, the surface scratched as though someone had dragged their nails across it again and again. Michael leaned closer, peering through the murk. At first he saw nothing, just the suggestion of shapes in the dark, then faintly something shifted. It was small, no more than the movement of a shadow, but it was enough to make him take a step back. That's when he heard it. A single, deliberate tap from the other side of the door. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The sound was faint, yet sharp enough to cut through the heavy stillness around him. He stood frozen, his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. Another tap came, slower this time, as if whoever, or whatever, was inside knew he was listening. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see Frank or another member of staff standing in the hallway behind him. But the corridor was empty, swallowed in shadow. He turned back to the door, his heart thudded painfully in his chest. With a shaky hand, he tried the handle. It didn't budge. The metal was icy under his fingers, biting into his skin. He stepped closer to the window again, wiping away a patch of grime with his sleeve. The flashlight beam swept across the interior. For a moment it was nothing but black, then, just for a second, something pale and smooth flashed in the light. Like the curve of a cheek or the arch of a bare shoulder retreating into the dark, the tapping stopped. Michael stood there listening, his own breathing the only sound. Then came a new noise. Not from behind the door but from the hallway he'd entered through, soft, deliberate footsteps. He spun around, light slicing through the corridor. Empty, but the air felt different now, charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Slowly, almost unwillingly, his gaze drifted back to the morgue door. The window was no longer clouded, it was perfectly clear. And pressed against the glass, inches from his face, was a hand, small, bone-white, and perfectly still. Michael stumbled back so fast his shoulder slammed into the tiled wall. The hand stayed there unmoving, fingers splayed against the glass as if it had been waiting for him. His flashlight beam quivered, throwing jagged shadows along the corridor. He blinked once, twice, and in that instant the hand was gone. He felt the cold before he realized it. The temperature had dropped sharply, a biting chill creeping through his jacket. His breath came out in short, visible clouds. Somewhere deep in the hallway, a metallic clang echoed, followed by a low, dragging sound that seemed to move closer, then fade as if circling. A voice broke the silence, so faint he almost mistook it for his own thoughts. It was a woman's voice, fragile, breathless. The sound came from behind the door. Michael's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs carried him forward instead. His fingertips brushed the door again, and this time he noticed deep gouges in the metal, thin, parallel lines, like someone had clawed at it in despair. He pressed his ear against the cold surface. Nothing, then, without warning, the handle jerked violently, rattling against the lock once, twice. Then a pause, followed by a soft scraping, as if nails were slowly dragging down the inside of the door. Michael staggered back, heart hammering. The footsteps behind him returned. Faster now, he swung the flashlight toward the hall, but instead of emptiness, he saw movement. A figure tall and thin at the very edge of the light, too far to make out details, too still to be alive. And when he took a step forward, it slid soundlessly into the shadows, vanishing like smoke. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. He forced himself to take a step toward where the figure had been, the narrow beam of his flashlight sweeping across the cracked tiles. Nothing. Only the dim stretch of corridor and the heavy, oppressive silence that felt like it was pressing against his skin. He turned back toward the morgue door and froze. The small window was no longer empty. A face was there now, pale and almost featureless in the dim light, as if the skin had been smoothed over, leaving only faint hollows where eyes and a mouth should be. It lingered for a heartbeat, then slipped away into darkness. A sound followed, not footsteps, not tapping. It was a slow, rhythmic thud, like the beating of something massive and alive muffled by walls. Michael took a step back, his shoulder blades pressing against the cold tiles. He suddenly became aware of a draft, not from the door but from somewhere behind him. He swung the light around. Halfway down the corridor, an old service elevator stood open, its gate halfway up, chains rusted but swaying slightly as if it had just been used. The air spilling from it was colder still, tinged with the same faint sweetness he'd smelled earlier. Against every instinct, he moved toward it. The inside was dark, but when he leaned closer, he saw something on the floor. A hospital ID badge, cracked and discolored, the name barely legible, Helen Price. Before he could process it, the elevator chains rattled violently, the gate slamming shut on its own. And from deep below, somewhere far beneath the hospital, came the sound of slow, deliberate breathing. Michael staggered back from the elevator, his flashlight beam skittering wildly across the walls. The breathing below was steady, patient, as if whatever was down there knew he wasn't leaving. His mind reeled. Helen Price. The same Helen who had warned him days ago, the one he'd seen in the cafeteria. How could her badge be down here unless it wasn't from now? He backed away, eyes darting between the morgue door and the elevator. The air felt thicker now, each breath harder to draw. The faint sweetness had grown stronger, cloying as if it was coating his throat. Somewhere behind him, a metallic clink echoed like something small hitting the tile. He turned. Lying in the middle of the corridor was a ring of old-fashioned keys, tarnished and bent. He didn't remember seeing them before. His flashlight picked out a small metal tag on one, stamped with the word Morgue. Before he could reach for it, a shadow slid across the wall beside him. Not moving along the floor but stretching, warping, as if cast by a body that wasn't there. It glided toward the morgue door, stopping just short of it, then rose tall, impossibly tall, until its head brushed the low ceiling. The breathing stopped. For a long moment, everything was silent. Then, from the other side of the morgue door came a sound that froze him in place. Not tapping this time, not scratching, It was a slow, deliberate knock 3 times followed by a voice low and hoarse speaking his name. Michael's grip tightened around the flashlight until his knuckles ached. The voice was unmistakable, low, rasping, but somehow it carried the exact rhythm of his own name. He didn't answer, couldn't. Every muscle in his body screamed to move, but his legs felt rooted to the floor. The morgue door shuddered once, then again, harder this time. Dust fell from the ceiling, drifting through the cold air like ash. The third impact rattled the chain against the metal, though he knew it was still unhooked from before. Michael, the voice was closer now, almost as if it was on his side of the door. He backed toward the elevator, but the gate was sealed shut. Behind him, the old service light flickered, casting the hallway in a sickly yellow glow. When he turned back, the morgue door was ajar, just an inch, but enough to see a thin slice of blackness beyond. A pale shape slid into view, slow and deliberate. Not a face this time, but a shoulder, an arm, and in that hand, dangling loosely, was the same ID badge he'd found minutes ago. It swayed gently, catching the light. Michael stumbled backward, pressing himself against the elevator gate. The figure didn't step forward. Instead, it leaned into the gap, head tilting unnaturally to one side, as if studying him. The light above flickered once more, and in that instant of darkness the door slammed shut with a deafening clang. The sound reverberated through the basement, followed by silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped. When the light steadied, the corridor was empty. The morgue door was sealed tight again, the chain and padlock exactly as they'd been days before. Only one thing had changed. On the tile at Michael's feet lay the ID badge, but now the name printed on it was Helen Price. It was his own. Michael never spoke about that night. He finished his shift, walked out of the hospital, and didn't look back. Within a week, he'd quit the job, claiming he needed something closer to home. But the truth was simpler. He couldn't shake the feeling that the morgue wasn't done with him. Sometimes, late at night, he swore he could still hear that slow, deliberate knock echoing in his head. Once, in a crowded subway station, he thought he saw the tall, thin figure from the basement standing at the far end of the platform. When the train passed, it was gone. The hospital never reopened the morgue. Officially, it remains sealed for safety reasons. But if you ask around, quietly, you'll hear the same thing I did. The chain isn't the only thing keeping that door closed. Maybe one day someone else will hear the knocking, maybe they'll answer. If you enjoyed this story and want to uncover more chilling mysteries like it, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share your thought. HTS in the comments, and tell me if you found your name on that badge, would you stay or would you run?